The Viking kneels. His beard brushes the dirt. His scarred hands press flat against the earth. But this isn't Odin's hall or Thor's shrine. His head bows toward Mecca. How could a man raised on mead, pork feasts, and the roar of longships whisper prayers written in Arabic? To the men watching, it must have felt like blasphemy. To history, it became one of the strangest transformations of the Viking Age. A Viking king, once feared across northern seas, turns to the faith of Islam. To most, that sounds impossible. Vikings are remembered as raiders, axe in one hand, drinking horn in the other. But history hides stranger truths. This isn't just a story of faith. It's a story of trade, survival, and worlds colliding. Because the Vikings weren't only raiders of England or pillagers of monasteries. Many sailed east. They followed frozen rivers through the lands of the Slavs and steppe nomads, into the domains of the Khazars, a Turkic people who once ruled much of southern Russia, and beyond, toward the glittering wealth of the Islamic caliphates. Those rivers carried them to markets humming with spices, silks, and silver coins stamped with Arabic script. They carried them into societies where every deal was governed not by brute force, but by law, contracts, and faith. And in those lands, some Vikings discovered that the axe was no longer enough. To survive, they would have to change. Some wore masks of foreign faiths, some only pretended, and a few went further. So tonight, we follow their story, from frozen rivers to burning deserts, from the wooden halls of Odin to the prayer mats of Mecca. This is the story of the Viking king who became a Muslim. Picture it, a Viking warband, far from the salt spray of the North Sea. Instead of waves crashing against longships, the air is frozen stiff. Men lean their shoulders into wooden boats, dragging them across ice-choked rivers. Oars snap under strain, boots crunch in the snow. Every sound feels like it could echo into an ambush. These weren't the familiar waters of Scandinavia. They were venturing into what we now call Russia and Ukraine, lands controlled by rival powers. The Khazars, a Turkic steppe empire, demanded tribute at toll points. Muslim merchants, who ran the crossroads between rivers and deserts, watched every move with suspicion. To survive here, Vikings had to gamble everything. Each bend of the river might lead to trade, or to death. Most people today picture Vikings storming west, raiding monasteries in England, burning villages in France. But many of their boldest journeys went east. These rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, were their highways. They carried longboats not just through streams, but across marshes and forests, through icy currents that broke men's hands on the oars. Why push on? The answer was simple. Silver. Silver dirhams, coins of the Islamic Caliphate, stamped with Arabic inscriptions. They flowed out of Baghdad like lifeblood through veins. And for the Norse, these coins were worth more than the gold of monasteries. They lined belts, filled graves, and turned raiders into merchants. But silver came with rules. To enter these markets, you couldn't rely on the sword alone. A chieftain used to ruling by strength suddenly had to obey contracts and scales. A warrior used to plundering had to bow to market hours. And as they marched further, their world opened wider. Imagine a Norseman stepping into Baghdad, then the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most advanced empires on earth. Libraries stacked with knowledge, bazaars humming with voices from 3 continents. For a man raised on firelit halls of timber, it must have felt like stepping onto another planet. These rivers weren't just paths of trade. They were corridors into civilizations far older, richer, and more disciplined than anything the Vikings had known. Every step south pushed them further from home and closer to transformation. What would it feel like to see an entire market freeze in silence, while every man around you suddenly turned east to pray? One moment, you're haggling over furs and silver. The next, the merchant across from you drops his scales mid-count. Conversations vanish, and in perfect unison, the crowd bows low, foreheads pressed to the ground. For a Viking, raised on wild feasts and drunken chants to Thor, this must have felt unreal. The day here didn't revolve around raiding or mead. It revolved around the call to prayer. Alcohol, the very drink that bound their feasts, was banned. Mead, ale, wine, forbidden. Pork, a staple of their diets, was unclean. Imagine the shock of offering a salted slab of pork as a gesture of friendship, only to see your host recoil in disgust. Customs that defined their pride turned into insults overnight. And the differences didn't end there. Muslim writers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century diplomat, described the Rus, these Viking traders, as giants covered in tattoos, but crude in their habits. He admired their strength, but was horrified by their unwashed bodies, their drinking, even how they shared a single filthy basin of water to clean themselves. To him, they were both magnificent and disgusting. And yet, even as he judged, he couldn't deny their power. These towering strangers with axes at their sides commanded attention. They were outsiders, both feared and needed. For the Vikings, every misstep mattered. Ignore customs and trade doors slammed shut. Bend and fortunes opened. The shocks of prayer, food, and ritual weren't just curiosities. They were tests. Tests that forced warriors of Odin to bend or to break. And in that bending, the first cracks appeared. Some wore masks of faith just to survive, but others started to wonder if there was strength in this new rhythm of life. Why would fierce pagan warriors suddenly claim to be Christian? On the surface, it makes no sense. These were men who sang songs to Odin while standing knee-deep in blood, men who carved images of Thor's hammer into stone. Yet in the crowded markets of the East, where silver flowed like rivers and powerful rulers controlled who could buy and sell, many Vikings dropped their own gods the moment business was on the line. They didn't suddenly believe in the cross. They wore it like a mask, a disguise that unlocked doors. Reports from Muslim writers describe exactly this situation. Among them was Ibn Khurradadbi, an official who wrote on trade and travel in the 9th century. He noted how Rus merchants, these northern traders we link with the Vikings, claimed to be Christians when dealing in foreign lands. Imagine the strangeness. Men who had grown up burning offerings to Odin, men who carved runes into their ships, now pointing to crosses on their clothing, or inventing stories about baptism to get better deals. They weren't converting because they felt touched by faith. They were converting because it worked, because it kept markets open. For them, religion wasn't about creeds or prayers. It was about survival. Think of it like a passport today. Without the right papers, you can't move freely, can't pass a border, can't do business. For the Vikings entering Muslim lands, calling themselves Christians was the stamp they needed. It made them recognizable, less threatening, part of the system instead of outsiders. And once the label was in place, trade could flow. Silver dirhams could move into their hands, furs, slaves, and amber could be handed across counters. Calling themselves Christian didn't mean giving up Odin. It meant profit. But here's the irony. You have to stop and notice it. These same warriors raided monasteries in the West. They stole crosses from church altars. They cut down priests and dragged chalices out of stone churches. To European Christians, the Rus were monsters, storming across rivers to destroy holy places. But as soon as those same men set foot in markets under Muslim control, they spoke with the voice of Christians. What they destroyed in the West, they claimed in the East as their own badge of identity. The mask was thin, and yet it worked.
That doesn't mean it was comfortable.
Wearing one faith in the morning and another at night brings risk. Imagine the strain of keeping up the act. In one city, you stand before merchants saying you belong to the church. In another camp, around your own warriors, you hold the horn of mead and boast about sacrifices to Odin. In both spaces, saying the wrong thing could end everything. Slip in front of Muslim traders, and you risk losing all access. Admit too much to your own men, and they might accuse you of betrayal. So these leaders balanced on a knife's edge, wearing masks, playing roles, switching, depending on where they were. The fear of being found out must have echoed through every deal. How do you explain why you claim one faith in public, but another back home? How do you trust allies when they see you change identities? For Viking chiefs who built reputations on strength and loyalty, the very act of bending could be seen as weakness. And yet, what choice did they have? Arms alone could not buy silk or silver. Force could not keep ships safe through toll stations. Pretending to believe was easier than fighting a war they couldn't win. This shows us something key about early diplomacy. Religion wasn't only belief, it was political currency. It created alliances, built trust, and granted access to networks larger than any single warband. A Viking carrying a Christian identity became part of a shared understanding that reached from one border to the next. The mask was thin, but it worked because everyone pretended to believe in the mask itself. Maintaining it allowed them to walk in circles that would otherwise slam shut. It turned raiders into businessmen and set the stage for deeper shifts that went beyond silver coins. And Vikings were nothing if not pragmatic. If killing priests worked in one region and speaking like Christians worked in another, they would do both. Their loyalty was to survival, to profit, and to the reputation of their leaders. Faith to them was just another tool on their belt. What mattered was what could be gained, not what was written on the soul. This cold practicality is what let them move between worlds, their ships slipping through waters where cultures collided. By wearing masks, these warriors showed they could bend without breaking. They proved themselves masters at adaptation. And yet, not all of them stayed at the surface. Behind the masks, some took steps their followers may never have expected. They didn't just pretend. They began to believe. They left behind evidence still visible in graves and treasures etched with foreign names. What do we make of Viking treasures etched with the name of Allah? You expect swords, shields, maybe a drinking horn in their graves, but instead, Arabic letters. Curved, flowing script, glowing on silver. Words from a holy book buried in Scandinavian soil. Why would a Norse warrior carry the name of a foreign god into the afterlife? Was it belief or fashion? One of the most striking finds comes from Birka, a Viking trading hub in Sweden. Archaeologists uncovered a silver ring inscribed with tiny Kufic script, the Arabic alphabet used at the time. Some read it as Allah, others argued it was just a copied pattern, meaningless decoration. But even if the letters were misunderstood, the fact remains. Someone chose to carry that ring into their grave. And a grave is never random. What you take into death reflects what mattered in life. And Birka was not alone. Rich textiles with similar inscriptions have been pulled from Viking burials. Some fabrics carried repeating patterns of the word Allah or the name Ali. These weren't made in Scandinavia. They came from Persia, from workshops tied into the vast networks of the Islamic world. Imagine a chieftain in Sweden buried under silks that once passed through Baghdad's markets. That's not just trade. That's cultural exchange woven into the very shrouds of the dead. So the question sharpens. Were these men simply showing off wealth, or were they carrying faith itself into their final sleep? The Oseberg ship burial in Norway gives us the bigger picture. Inside that great ship, one of the richest Viking graves ever found, lay silks traced to the Islamic world. A farm girl in the fjords would never see such colors. But here, in death, Persian patterns and Muslim craftsmanship cloaked the body. If their afterlife demanded the best, why choose silks and symbols from so far away? It forces us to see Scandinavia not as an isolated corner, but as a crossroads. Silver dirhams lined belts, Kufic letters adorned rings, silks draped over wooden halls. Islam had reached the Viking world, not as rumor, but as touch, as fabric, as treasure. So next time you picture a Viking grave, don't imagine only swords and runestones. Picture Arabic letters etched in silver. Picture Persian silks wrapped around northern bones. Even in death, they carried the marks of worlds far beyond their own. Now step into the 9th century. A Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan travels north from Baghdad. His mission? To deliver messages from the Abbasid Caliph to the Volga Bulgars, a kingdom on the steppe. But what he found on that journey has become our most vivid eyewitness account of the Rus, the Viking traders pushing down the rivers. And what he saw shocked him. To Ibn Fadlan, the Rus were towering men. Tattooed from fingertips to neck, blonde hair, strong frames, weapons always at hand. He called them the most perfect bodies he had ever seen. But then came his revulsion. He describes their habits, the way they washed in shared bowls of water until it turned foul, the dirt under their nails, the smell of bodies unwashed for weeks. To him, they were giants, and yet filthy. Then came the funeral. A Viking chieftain died, and Ibn Fadlan was taken to watch. Over days, his companions built a wooden ship, laid it with weapons, animals, and goods. But that wasn't enough. A slave girl was chosen to die with him. She drank. She was paraded from tent to tent, and on the final day she was lifted above the men's heads, stabbed, and laid beside her master. Then the ship was set ablaze. Smoke and screams carried into the sky. To Ibn Fadlan, this was barbarism. To the Rus, it was honor. What makes his account so powerful is the contrast. Ibn Fadlan came from a world of ritual purity, prayers 5 times a day, strict codes of washing, a society that valued discipline. What he saw instead were men who spat into bowls, smeared dirt, drank heavily, and laughed through ceremonies. And yet, they were strong, frighteningly loyal, impressive in ways he could not deny. Through his eyes, we see the Vikings caught in transition. They traded with Muslims. They carried silks from Persia. They coveted silver coins stamped with Arabic script. But they still clung to old rituals of blood and fire. They were not fully pagan, not fully converted. They stood between worlds, trapped in the balance of survival. And when you place Ibn Fadlan's words beside the graves, the coins, the rings, you get a full picture. Not raiders untouched by outside influence, not converts abandoning their gods overnight, but men walking a narrow line. 1 foot in the world of Odin, 1 foot in the world of Allah. So when we imagine a Viking king kneeling toward Mecca, we see more than belief. We see survival, trade, the fragile art of adaptation. Every silver coin, every silk thread, every mask they wore shows how necessity could bend identity. History isn't locked in stone. It's choices, bargains, masks worn like armor. And sometimes, those masks change the world. So the next time you picture a Viking, don't stop at the storm and the longship. Picture him in a foreign market, silent, watching merchants bow in prayer. Picture him hiding his gods for silver. Picture him weighing not just goods, but faith itself. If this story made you see Vikings differently, subscribe for more Untold history. Because the past is stranger and more connected than we imagine.